Welcome, my name is David Driscoll. In this video, I want to talk about managing conflict. And I want to start by separating conflict from problems. Conflict is always a problem, but not all problems are conflict. So for example, we seek out problems as a form of recreation. Crossword puzzles, Scrabble, chess, these are problems, but they're a cognitive challenge and we deal with them cognitively. When a conflict occurs, by stark contrast, we become, and this is a phrase I'm going to use repeatedly in this video, cognitively disabled. We can't think. This reflects the fact that our first reaction to the new, the novel, the different, the unexpected, the threatening, the disagreement, for many of us, this is going to tend to produce an emotional response. To the extent that it produces an emotional response, we become cognitively disabled. Think about those words. Cognitive have to do with thinking, and we're disabled. That is, we can't think. So I'm going to talk about some strategies in this video about how you can deal with conflict when you or the other person start to become cognitively disabled. And it's not an either-or proposition. You might be slightly emotionally involved or more severely emotionally involved. So we'll talk about that spectrum. First, let me talk about some sources of conflict, because I think it's important to have a grounding on where conflict comes from. It seems to be universal. It's all around us. It's in all of our lives. Where does it come from? It can come from a variety of sources. It can come from different belief systems. And interestingly enough, belief systems don't require any data. In fact, belief systems don't even want data. And that isn't a criticism of a belief. It's simply a statement that when I believe something, I don't necessarily, in fact, I necessarily don't use data to support that belief. The belief stands on its own. It's faith. Different perspectives of a goal, an event, or a situation. Having worked for a brief period of time with law enforcement personnel, one axiom I learned is that if you have four people observing an event, an accident, a crime, you're going to get four completely, often contradictory perceptions of that same event. And people will argue it out. Conflict will arise when one perception tries to eclipse another. Different interpretations of the same data or information. In another video, I talked about reliable data versus alternative facts. And right now, thanks to the internet, we can find data to support almost any position we want to take. And we can look at the same data, you and I, the viewer, me, and we might interpret that data differently. And that can produce conflict. Different expectations. If I work for you, you work for me, and we don't have shared expectations for performance, conflict can often occur as a result. Differing biases. We all go through life accumulating bias. And these biases will run counter to others' biases, and what is the result? Conflict. And again, what makes conflict conflict? That cognitive disability. When my bias disagrees with your bias, and biases, by the way, can often be belief-based, that is, they don't require any data, they can produce conflict in which both parties become cognitively disabled. Bad news. When I have to say no to a customer, for example, or I have to give a negative response to something that someone wanted, conflict can arise. So I've gone through some of the sources of conflict. You as the viewer are aware of all of them, and there are many more, but what do you do? All right, so here you are in a situation, and either you start to experience a high level emotion, or you see the other person start to experience a high level of emotion. What do you do? There's no panacea, there's no magic answer. I wish there was. The steps I'm going to go through, though, will increase the likelihood of you being able to deal with conflict effectively, and more specifically, deal with that cognitive disability. Number one, give people experiencing emotions time. Back away. Let the conversation breathe a bit. Don't just stay focused on the conflict. In talking with someone who was an expert in negotiation, she talked about how when a negotiation reached a loggerhead, she would take a break, go have a cup of coffee, come back 10, 15 minutes later. Very often those emotions were somewhat reduced. use an empathic reflection. It's very, very hard to be in conflict with someone who's listening to you. Now, the empathic reflection means that instead of saying, I understand or I know how you feel, which very often produces disbelief in the other person, the empathic reflection proves that you've listened. I've got a whole other video on that topic that you can take a look at. It's very hard to resist, and it reduces, I think, that cognitive disability because it feels good to be listened to. It feels good to be listened to. Engage in a cognitive activity. This is as simple as counting backwards from 10 when you start to lose your temper. It's that simple. Counting, doing the times tables, reciting a line of poetry or a song, requires you to use a part of your brain that's very different from the part of your brain that's engaged when you're feeling very emotional. So engage in a cognitive activity. And you might put two together here and say, give people experiencing strong emotions time. And when you back off a bit, do the times tables. Count backwards from 10. You may find, interestingly enough, as I have, that I have much greater control when I get back into the interaction. Resist being defensive. Interestingly enough, defensiveness looks a lot like aggression. And when I'm dealing with someone who's defensive, I'm liable to become more aggressive in that argument, in that conflict. Find alternative words or language, especially when, and a lot of conflict is what you could call a semantic difference, where we're stuck on language, process versus process, really where the language is less meaningful than what's behind the language. So change up the language. Be prepared to accept the other person's terminology. In a customer service situation, resist saying no as a first response. Customer calls in, asks for something, or comes in and asks for something. You know you can't do it, so you say no, can't help you. Instead, this is vital, ask the customer what he or she is trying to do. You may find that in some instances, there's a compromise position. And at least you're treating the customer with courtesy and responsiveness. You're expressing an interest in their point of view. Don't focus only on differences. And this is something I think that's inherent in a lot of conflict, where we get stuck only in those things which separate us, instead of thinking about those things where we can agree, where we can compromise, where we can find common ground. So those steps will not eliminate conflict, but they will help you to handle it. They will reduce it. They increase your probability of being successful. If you've got something from this video, please hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more to come.